Dakota Territory, 1880. While every settler raced to throw up the quickest cabin before winter, Lars Jensen was still wrapping his 12 by 18-foot shack in wire mesh come late September. His neighbors called it wasteful, building what looked like a giant bird's nest around perfectly good 8-inch pine logs. They called him a fool for packing 6 inches of forest duff and dry pine needles into that wire cage when everyone knew a thick log wall was all a man needed. Jensen had learned different lessons in the Norwegian forests, watching how deep needle mats kept soil unfrozen while bare ground turned to iron. But here in timber country, locals dismissed such ideas as old country nonsense. Then October 15th arrived without warning, 3 feet of snow in a single day, 26 degrees below zero. The start of what would become the hard winter of 1880 to 81, 7 months of cold that buried rail lines and cut off entire settlements. Standard single-wall cabins began to fail. Neighbors burned cord after cord just to keep interior temperatures in the 30s, ice forming on their water buckets despite roaring stoves. But that fool's shack wrapped in pine needles. A simple thermometer nailed inside showed 52 degrees while the one outside read 26 below, an 18-degree advantage that meant the difference between sleeping in shirt sleeves and nearly freezing. What did this Norwegian forester understand about forest floors, dead air, and heat that everyone else had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love seeing where these historical lessons reach. Lars Jensen stepped out of the timber company wagon on a September morning in 1880, surveying the 12 by 18-foot shack that would be his home through the coming winter. The structure sat on a small rise near the logging operation, its walls built from single-course pine logs 8 to 10 inches thick, roughly chinked with mud, moss, and strips of bark wedged into the gaps. Previous occupants had done adequate work for a temporary shelter, but Jensen had spent enough years in Norwegian forests to read the signs of a hard winter coming. The aspens had turned early, their leaves already dropping in late August. Squirrels were gathering pine cones with unusual intensity, and the first frost had struck 2 weeks ahead of normal. Animal instincts rarely lied about what lay ahead. Jensen's first task was securing insulation material for the walls. In the old country, families banked their timber houses with sod, straw, and brush before the deep cold arrived, creating thick barriers that trapped still air against the logs. Here in Dakota Territory, he asked around the settlement for hay or straw, only to learn that supplies were thin and expensive this far into timber country. Most locals simply tossed snow against their lower walls when winter arrived, hung wool blankets inside for extra warmth, and fed their stoves harder when the temperature dropped. When people did attempt insulation, they stuffed whatever odds and ends they could find into wall cavities, wads of straw, sawdust, newspapers, or cotton batting, wherever gaps allowed access. Walking through the surrounding forest, Jensen studied the thick mats of duff that carpeted the ground beneath the pine stands. This decomposing layer of needles and organic matter, often 8 to 12 inches deep around mature tree bases, remained unfrozen even when surface soil turned to iron in the worst cold. He had observed this phenomenon countless times in Scandinavian forests, where underground smoldering fires could persist for hours or even weeks beneath such natural insulation. The principle was simple. Chaotic fiber created millions of tiny air pockets, and still air was one of nature's best insulators. Jensen made his decision. He would wrap his entire cabin in forest duff, held in place by wire netting. At the settlement's general store, he purchased 150 feet of light wire mesh, the same hexagonal fencing already used throughout the frontier for poultry pens and small animal enclosures. Back at the cabin, he began installing wooden spacers around the perimeter, simple blocks that held the wire 6 to 8 inches away from the log walls. The work was methodical and precise. Each spacer had to be positioned to create an even gap, ensuring the wire would form a consistent cage around the entire structure. News of Jensen's project spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors gathered to watch him stretch the wire mesh around his cabin, shaking their heads at what appeared to be a senseless waste of time and materials. Eli Thompson, a second-generation farmer who had built his own cabin using standard single-wall log construction, was particularly vocal in his criticism. "You're building a bird's nest, not a house," Thompson declared, watching Jensen secure the wire at the corners. "One stray coal from your stovepipe, and you'll go up like a hayrick." Others joined the chorus of skepticism. The local mill owner, who considered himself an authority on frontier construction, insisted that a good 10-inch pine log wall is all a man needs here. If that won't keep you warm, nothing will. The concerns about fire risk were not entirely unreasonable. Loosely packed straw and other dry cellulose materials had caused devastating house fires throughout the region. Newspapers, sawdust, and cotton batting used as makeshift insulation carried serious fire hazards, particularly when stuffed carelessly near stovepipes and chimney penetrations. Jensen listened to the criticism without argument, but he took careful precautions. He maintained a 2 to 3 inch air gap between his stovepipe and the planned duff layer, installing a simple sheet metal collar to deflect heat away from the organic material. He positioned the wire mesh so that the top of the future insulation layer would be capped under wooden slats, preventing sparks from falling directly into the dry needles. Most importantly, he planned to pack only thoroughly dried material, though he knew the outer layers would gradually absorb some ambient moisture during winter, actually reducing ignition risk. The real work began with the needle gathering. Jensen spent 3 full days hauling dry pine needles and forest duff from the surrounding stands, filling the 6 to 8 inch gap around his cabin walls. The material packed easily, its springy texture conforming to the irregular spaces while maintaining enough loft to preserve insulating air pockets. At the corners, where packing was easier, he built the duff layer to nearly 10 inches thick. The completed installation gave his cabin the appearance of being wrapped in a mottled, tawny coat that shifted slightly with each breeze. Thompson and other neighbors continued their mockery as Jensen worked. "Building a house or a beaver dam?" became a common joke among the men gathering at the mill. Women were more circumspect, but Jensen noticed them studying his project with curious eyes, particularly Anna Thompson, Eli's wife, who had spent enough cold winters tracking every draft in her own cabin to recognize innovation when she saw it. By early October, Jensen had completed his duff wall and laid in 6 cords of split pine for the winter ahead. His neighbors considered 4 cords plenty for a normal winter in that country, but Jensen's forest experience had taught him to prepare for the worst case, not the average. The completed project had consumed 4 full days of labor beyond the initial wire installation, but as he surveyed his handiwork, Jensen felt confident he had built something that would perform when the weather turned serious. The first light snows arrived in mid-October, dusting the settlement and beginning to outline the strange profile of Jensen's wrapped cabin against the darkening forest. Soon enough, everyone would learn whether the Norwegian's brush pile was the work of a fool or a man who understood something about winter that the rest of them had missed. On October 15, 1880, the blizzard that would define the next 7 months struck eastern Dakota Territory without warning. 3 feet of snow fell in a single day, driven by winds that howled across the prairie at 30 to 40 miles per hour. This was not simply another early winter storm, but the opening assault of what would become known throughout the upper Midwest as the hard winter of 1880 to 81. By late November, repeated storms had piled snow 2 to 3 feet deep in open country, with drifts reaching over 5 feet along fence lines and tree breaks. Rail lines throughout Minnesota and Dakota Territory would soon be buried under snowdrifts higher than locomotive cabs, cutting off entire towns for months at a time. The settlement's first taste of serious cold came in early December, when overnight temperatures dropped to 10 degrees above zero on still nights. During these initial cold snaps, neighbors like Eli Thompson remained comfortable enough in front of their wood stoves, though complaints about drafts along the floor and ice forming on the inside corners of log walls became common topics of conversation. The reality of 19th century frontier construction was becoming apparent. Most cabins had minimal or no wall insulation beyond basic chinking. Any attempt at thermal improvement consisted of mud, straw, and moss jammed between logs, with small bits of straw or paper stuffed around window and door frames where gaps allowed access. Jensen's duff-wrapped cabin performed differently during these early tests. while his neighbors dealt with candle flames that leaned in persistent drafts and frost that formed along log-to-log joints where wind found its way through. Jensen's interior remained remarkably stable. The outer skin of packed needles shifted slightly when strong winds buffeted the structure, but the chaotic mat of fine fibers and trapped air effectively killed the breeze before it could penetrate the log walls. The principle was identical to what modern builders understand about loose-fill insulation. Masses of fiber create millions of tiny still air pockets, dramatically slowing both conductive and convective heat transfer. The first real test of both construction methods came during a sustained storm in mid-December that brought winds gusting to 40 miles per hour and drove snow dust horizontally across the landscape. Inside Thompson's cabin, the wind found every imperfection in the log construction. Snow sifted through cracks between the logs, accumulating in small piles on the floor near the walls. Frost formed visibly at joints where the wind pressure forced cold air through the mud and moss chinking. The family gathered close to their stove, but even 4 feet away, the temperature differential was noticeable. Jensen monitored his own cabin's performance with the methodical approach of a man trained to observe forest conditions. He had brought a simple alcohol thermometer from his previous forestry work, a tool that had cost nearly a day's wages but proved invaluable for tracking interior conditions. During the December storm, with outside temperatures holding steady at 5 degrees below zero and wind driving snow against both structures, Jensen recorded interior readings that consistently held 12 to 15 degrees warmer than what Thompson reported from his standard log cabin. The difference became more pronounced as December progressed into January. On calm nights, when outside temperatures dropped to zero or slightly below, Thompson's cabin interior would reach a comfortable 60 degrees near the stove, but corners and floor zones remained in the low 40s despite constant stoking. Jensen's cabin maintained similar temperatures near his stove while keeping corner areas in the low 50s, a critical difference for overall comfort and fuel efficiency. Jensen began keeping informal records of his fuel consumption compared to his neighbors. Thompson and others with standard single-wall log construction were burning approximately 1 armload of split pine every hour during the coldest periods, roughly 20 pounds of wood, just to maintain marginal comfort levels. Jensen found he could achieve better interior temperatures using about 70% of that fuel load, a significant advantage that would become crucial as winter deepened and wood gathering became increasingly difficult. The social dynamics of the settlement began shifting as word spread about the temperature differences between cabins. Anna Thompson, who had initially remained silent during her husband's mockery of Jensen's project, began asking practical questions about construction details. She had spent enough cold winters managing household comfort to recognize superior performance when she encountered it. Other women in the community, who bore primary responsibility for monitoring fuel consumption and maintaining interior warmth for children and elderly family members, took notice of Jensen's reduced wood requirements. By late December, snow depth in open country had reached 3 feet, with drifts over 5 feet along any obstruction. Getting to standing timber for fuel required snowshoes and hours of work in bitter cold, making fuel efficiency a matter of survival rather than mere convenience. Thompson and his neighbors found themselves waking before dawn to feed their stoves, then spending daylight hours cutting and hauling wood through knee-deep snow just to maintain minimal interior temperatures overnight. Jensen's situation was notably different. His cabin lost heat slowly enough that he could sleep 6 hours without the stove going completely cold, a luxury his neighbors could not afford. The duff wall's thermal mass and insulating properties meant that even when his fire died down to coals during the night, interior temperatures dropped gradually rather than plummeting. Morning restarts required less fuel to restore comfortable conditions, and the cabin reached target temperatures faster than standard log construction. The cumulative effect of these advantages was becoming clear to practical observers throughout the settlement. Jensen's brush pile was not simply holding its own against conventional construction methods. It was demonstrably outperforming them under increasingly severe conditions. As January approached with promises of even deeper cold, the question was no longer whether Jensen's innovation worked, but whether standard frontier building practices would prove adequate for what lay ahead. The deep freeze arrived in mid-January with a brutality that stunned even veteran frontiersmen. An extended cold wave settled over Dakota Territory, bringing sustained temperatures that plunged to 26 degrees below zero and held there for days at a time. Historical records from the upper Midwest document similar Arctic outbreaks during the 1880s, with some Minnesota and Wisconsin stations recording temperatures as low as 40 degrees below zero. This was weather that tested every assumption about adequate shelter and fuel supplies. On a particularly savage night when outside temperatures reached 26 below with light winds, Jensen conducted a careful measurement that would become legendary in local memory. Using his forestry thermometer, he recorded an interior temperature of 52 degrees at the center of his cabin, measured 4 feet above the floor. The same evening, Eli Thompson, burning his stove at maximum capacity with the same approximate fuel load, managed only 34 degrees at the identical measurement point in his standard log cabin. The 18-degree difference was not an estimate or approximation, it was documented fact measured with the same instrument under identical conditions. Thompson initially dismissed the readings as impossible, convinced that Jensen must be manipulating his stove or using some undisclosed fuel advantage. To settle the question, the two men agreed to a controlled comparison that would eliminate variables and provide definitive proof of their cabin's relative performance. Both structures would let their fires die down to coals overnight, then relight at dawn using identical procedures. They would burn matched loads of split pine, one arm load weighing approximately 20 pounds, every hour for 4 hours. Doors would remain closed except for brief entries to tend fires. Outside temperature held steady at 20 degrees below zero throughout the test. After 4 hours of identical fuel input, the results were undeniable. Thompson's cabin interior measured 40 degrees near the center and 34 degrees in the far corner, despite his best efforts to maximize heat output and minimize heat loss. Jensen's cabin, using precisely the same fuel regimen, maintained 58 degrees near center and 50 degrees in the corner farthest from the stove. The consistent 18-degree advantage held across the entire interior space, proving that the difference was not simply a matter of stove placement or fuel quality. The explanation for Jensen's superior performance lay in fundamental principles of thermal transfer that frontier builders rarely understood. Natural fiber insulation worked primarily by trapping still air, and air itself was a remarkably poor conductor when prevented from moving. Historical evidence from across North America and Europe confirmed that families had used straw, hay, sawdust, and other plant fibers in walls for exactly this reason, long before the development of manufactured insulation materials. Forest duff possessed ideal characteristics for this. Application. Under pine trees and undisturbed stands, the decomposing layer of needles, fine twigs, and partially decomposed organic matter formed a dense but springy mat that maintained its structure while creating countless tiny air pockets. Modern ecological research has demonstrated that duff's insulating properties are so effective that underground smoldering fires can persist for hours or even weeks, kept alive by the material's ability to retain heat while limiting oxygen flow. Contemporary laboratory work on pressed pine needle blocks has measured thermal conductivity values around 0.02 to 0.02 4 watts per meter Kelvin, performance comparable to many modern commercial insulation panels. In practical terms, this meant that Jensen's 8-inch layer of properly dried and packed pine needles could match the insulating performance of materials that would not be commercially available for decades. The fire risk that had prompted Thompson's initial objections remained a legitimate concern. Early cellulose fill materials, including paper, straw, and sawdust, carried significant flammability risks that later required the development of fire retardant treatments. Jensen addressed these hazards through careful installation practices that demonstrated his understanding of thermal dynamics and fire behavior. He maintained a 2 to 3 inch air gap between his stovepipe and the duff layer, using a simple sheet metal collar to deflect radiant heat away from the organic material. The needles were thoroughly dried before packing, but the outer layers gradually absorbed ambient moisture during winter, slightly reducing ignition risk while maintaining insulating properties. The wire mesh installation proved crucial to the system's effectiveness. By holding the duff layer away from the log walls, Jensen created a continuous thermal break that prevented direct conduction from interior heat to exterior cold. This air gap, combined with the insulating properties of the organic material itself, created what modern engineers would recognize as a double wall system with cavity insulation, a design principle that would not become standard in residential construction until the 20th century. Word of the documented temperature differences spread throughout the settlement as neighbors witnessed the stark contrast in living conditions. While Thompson and others struggled to maintain interior temperatures in the low 40s despite burning cord after cord of precious firewood, Jensen worked comfortably in his cabin wearing only a wool shirt. His interior remained warm enough that water did not freeze overnight, and family activities could continue normally even during the worst cold snaps. The practical implications extended beyond mere comfort. Jensen's fuel efficiency advantage meant he could maintain superior interior conditions while consuming approximately 30% less firewood than his neighbors. During a bas winter, when getting to standing timber required snowshoes and hours of work in life-threatening cold, this difference represented not just convenience but survival margin. While others exhausted themselves daily hauling fuel through deep snow, Jensen could focus on other essential tasks or simply rest when weather conditions made outdoor work dangerous. The 18-degree gap between conventional wisdom and Jensen's innovation was becoming impossible for practical-minded settlers to ignore. As the hard winter's grip tightened and fuel supplies dwindled, the question was no longer whether the Norwegians' method worked, but whether anyone could afford to dismiss such documented advantages when lives hung in the balance. The hard winter proved relentless in ways that tested the limits of human endurance and frontier building practices. From the October blizzard through March of 1881, the blizzard pattern persisted with devastating consistency. Rail lines throughout Minnesota and Dakota Territory remained buried under snowdrifts that towered above locomotive cabs, cutting off coal shipments and manufactured supplies to isolated settlements. What had begun as a test of cabin construction became a siege that would determine who had built adequately and who had merely built hopefully. By February, the accumulated strain was visible throughout the community. Wood was no longer the cheap and endless resource that newcomers had assumed. Standing timber lay buried under 3 to 5 feet of snow, accessible only through backbreaking labor that required snowshoes and hours of chopping in temperatures that regularly dropped below 20 degrees below zero. Men who had confidently laid in 4 cords of firewood in autumn found themselves burning through their entire supply before the worst of winter had passed. Jensen tracked the fuel consumption patterns with the systematic approach that had served him in Norwegian forests. His neighbors with standard log construction were burning approximately 1 cord of split pine every 3 weeks during the deepest cold periods, desperately trying to maintain interior temperatures in the high 40s. Each cord represented days of dangerous work in conditions that claimed fingers and toes from men who stayed outside too long. Jensen's duff-wrapped cabin achieved similar or better interior comfort while consuming roughly 1 cord every 5 weeks, a difference that represented not just efficiency but survival margin. The mathematics of winter survival became grimly apparent as the siege extended through 15 weeks of sustained cold and frequent storms. Thompson and his neighbors burned approximately 5 cords of wood during the worst stretch, exhausting their reserves and forcing dangerous expeditions to reach buried timber. Jensen's superior thermal performance meant he consumed only 3 cords during the same period, leaving him with adequate reserves and energy for other essential tasks. The human cost of inefficient construction revealed itself in accumulated exhaustion and injury. Thompson, like other men with standard cabins, woke every few hours throughout the night to feed his stove, knowing that letting the fire die meant waking to interior temperatures near freezing. Days began before dawn with the desperate work of restoring warmth, followed by hours cutting and hauling firewood through snow that often reached their waists. Thompson's father, a man in his 60s who had helped build the family's cabin, suffered frostbite in his toes during one particularly brutal wood-hauling expedition. The injury left him limping and unable to contribute fully to the household's survival tasks. Jensen's situation presented a stark contrast to his neighbor's daily struggle. His cabin's thermal performance allowed him to sleep 6 hours straight without the stove going completely cold, something his neighbors could not risk. The duff wall's insulating properties meant that even when his fire died down to coals during the night, interior temperatures dropped gradually rather than plummeting toward the outside reading. Morning restarts required less fuel and time, and the cabin reached comfortable temperatures faster than standard construction. The crisis reached its peak during a particularly savage cold snap in late February, when outside temperatures plunged to 35 degrees below zero and held there for 3 consecutive nights. Thompson's cabin interior, despite constant stoking and the consumption of nearly a quarter quart of wood in 72 hours, sank to the low 20s by dawn of the third day. Frost formed inside on the water bucket, and family members could see their breath even huddled near the stove. It was during this crisis that pride gave way to survival instinct. Anna Thompson, who had quietly observed the temperature differences between cabins throughout the winter, made the decision that her husband's stubbornness would not cost their family their lives. She appeared at Jensen's door carrying bedrolls and a pot of stew, not asking permission but simply stating that the children would sleep in the warm cabin that night. Other families followed her lead, arriving with quiet dignity and sleeping arrangements, acknowledging without words that conventional wisdom had failed them. Jensen rearranged his modest space to accommodate neighbors' children, positioning bedrolls against the duff-insulated walls where temperatures remained most stable. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone who entered. While Thompson's cabin felt like a drafty ice house despite a roaring stove, Jensen's interior maintained comfortable conditions that allowed normal conversation and activity. Children who had spent weeks huddled in wool coats and blankets could play in regular clothing. Adults could remove outer layers and work with bare hands. The social dynamics of the settlement shifted permanently during those nights. Women who had initially dismissed Jensen's innovation as foreign eccentricity now asked detailed questions about construction techniques. How deep had he packed the needles? What type of wire mesh worked best? How did he prevent moisture buildup and rot in the organic material? Men who had mocked the brush pile found themselves studying the installation details, noting the spacing of the wooden blocks that held the wire away from the logs and the careful attention to gaps around the stovepipe. Conversations around Jensen's warm stove revealed the scope of knowledge that conventional frontier building had ignored. He spoke of Norwegian techniques for banking timber houses with sod and organic matter, creating thermal barriers that trapped still air against walls. He described observing how forest duff kept soil unfrozen while bare ground turned iron hard, and how indigenous hunters had long used similar principles in their winter shelters. What settlers had dismissed as primitive methods were revealed as sophisticated applications of thermal dynamics that European and native builders had refined through centuries of cold climate experience. As March arrived and the worst of the hard winter finally began to break, the settlement survivors faced a transformed understanding of adequate shelter. Jensen's foolish innovation had become the standard against which all other construction was measured, and the 18-degree advantage that had seemed impossible in autumn was now accepted fact among people who had staked their lives on such differences. Spring arrived in April of 1881 with the dramatic flooding that historically followed the hard winter, as massive snow accumulations melted and overwhelmed river systems throughout the upper Midwest. The settlement survived, but the experience had fundamentally altered how its residents understood the relationship between shelter and survival. Jensen never gloated about his vindication, instead quietly answering the steady stream of practical questions that came his way as neighbors planned improvements to their own buildings. The conversations around Jensen's cabin took on a different character as spring progressed into summer. Eli Thompson, his pride tempered by the memory of nights when his family had depended on Jensen's warm shelter, asked detailed questions about wire spacing and duff thickness. Anna Thompson wanted to know about preventing moisture buildup and protecting the organic material from rot during wet seasons. Other settlers inquired about adapting the technique for different cabin sizes and whether local materials could substitute for pine needles in areas where other tree species dominated. Jensen's responses revealed the depth of observation and traditional knowledge that had informed his innovation. He explained how he had studied the performance of forest duff through multiple seasons, noting how the material shed surface water while maintaining its insulating properties. He described the importance of proper drying before installation and the need for adequate ventilation to prevent moisture accumulation within the organic layer. Most importantly, he emphasized that the wire mesh system was not simply about holding needles in place, but creating the crucial air gap that prevented thermal bridging between interior warmth and exterior cold. Over the following 5 years, Jensen's techniques spread throughout the district in various adapted forms. Some settlers built similar wire and duff systems around new cabins, while others retrofitted existing structures by banking walls with organic material held in place by rough planking. The most successful adaptations followed Jensen's core principles, creating thick layers of fibrous material that trapped still air, maintaining gaps between insulation and structural walls, and paying careful attention to fire safety around heating systems. By the 1890s, travelers through the region noted the prevalence of brush-filled walls and pine filler as recognized construction practices, though not universal ones. County reminiscences from the period describe these techniques as known alternatives to standard log construction, part of a growing toolkit of cold climate building methods that drew from various immigrant traditions and indigenous practices. The innovation had evolved from one man's experiment into an accepted regional variant that anticipated later developments in natural fiber insulation. Jensen's success connected to broader patterns of resourceful building throughout North America and Europe during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Families routinely insulated with whatever fibrous materials were available: newspapers, cardboard, straw, sawdust, cotton, and various plant fibers, stuffing them into wall cavities and around openings wherever gaps allowed access. These primitive solutions represented practical applications of the same thermal principles that would later be formalized in manufactured cellulose insulation and natural fiber building panels. The vindication of Jensen's approach extended beyond immediate adoption to scientific validation that would emerge decades later. Modern researchers testing pressed pine needle panels have documented thermal conductivity values around 0.022 to 0.024 watts per meter. Kelvin, performance that matches many contemporary commercial insulation materials. Laboratory work has confirmed what Jensen observed through practical experience. Properly prepared organic fiber creates effective thermal barriers through the simple mechanism of trapping still air in countless tiny pockets. Forestry scientists and wilderness fire managers have provided additional confirmation of duff's remarkable insulating properties. Their studies of underground smoldering fires demonstrate how this natural material can retain heat so effectively that combustion continues for extended periods even when surface conditions would seem to preclude fire survival. This same heat retention characteristic that enables underground fires to persist also explains why Jensen's duff wall could maintain comfortable interior temperatures with reduced fuel input. The principles Jensen applied through intuition and observation align precisely with modern understanding of bio-based insulation systems. Contemporary high-performance building increasingly incorporates natural materials, straw bales, hemp fiber, wood fiber panels, and cellulose insulation that work through identical mechanisms of trapped air and thermal mass. The passive solar design movement has rediscovered many techniques that 19th century builders like Jensen developed through necessity and careful observation of natural systems. Jensen's legacy extended beyond construction techniques to demonstrate how traditional knowledge and practical innovation could outperform accepted wisdom when environmental conditions exceeded normal parameters. His willingness to adapt Scandinavian forest practices to frontier conditions, combined with careful observation of local materials and climate patterns, produced a solution that proved superior to standard methods precisely when superiority mattered most. The story of the duff-wrapped cabin illustrates a broader truth about frontier survival. The difference between adequate and superior preparation often became apparent only during crisis conditions that tested every assumption about good enough construction. In normal winters, Jensen's neighbors were correct that thick log walls provided sufficient thermal performance. But the hard winter was not normal, and when weather conditions exceeded the design parameters of conventional building, the man who had built for worst-case scenarios became the one everyone turned to for shelter. Jensen's innovation represented more than clever use of available materials. It demonstrated how careful observation of natural systems, combined with traditional knowledge from different climate regions, could produce building techniques that anticipated modern high performance construction by several decades. What frontier neighbors initially dismissed as foreign eccentricity proved to be sophisticated application of thermal dynamics that saved lives when conventional wisdom failed. The 18-degree advantage that had seemed impossible in autumn became accepted fact among people who had experienced its life-saving reality during the hardest winter on record.